Well, thank you for your work so far in the class on the origins of Greece and on the pre-Socratics, and I look forward to reading what you have to say as we go along. I've been looking at some of the postings in the pre-Socratics discussion board, and I hope to be commenting today and tomorrow on some of those. I've opened up the board for Socrates, and I'll try and get the rest of the class open. I didn't realize that there were things that weren't open yet in the classroom, and I'll try and go through and make sure that all of the settings are set to open so that nothing is closed. If you're missing anything, please let me know, and I will try to make sure that that's up there and readily available. I wanted to say something about the Russell book because several of you commented on it that you like that text in particular. And I like the Russell book so well that I have this edition. It's the History of Western Philosophy from the Folio Society. And it comes with its handy-dandy slipcover and such because I like to read this one so well. One of the things that this edition has that your edition does not have is an introduction by a particular philosopher named A.C. Grayling. And A.C. Grayling points out some very interesting facets about Russell's text that make it one of my favorites, even if I don't always agree with Russell. It says in his introduction, "Throughout the book, Russell's genius for the succinct, biting, often witty encapsulations of others' views is exploited to the full, to the delight of readers, but to critics the result sometimes seems too glib, slick, quick and shallow to be informative. An excellent example both of his style and his manner is afforded by his discussion of Aristotle's criticisms of Plato's doctrines." And we'll get to that eventually. It is part of your reading. It says, "Plato's communism annoys Aristotle. It would lead, he says, to anger against lazy people and to the sort of quarrels that are common between fellow travelers. It is better if each minds his own business. Property should be private, but people should be so trained in benevolence as to allow the use of it to largely be common. Benevolence and generosity are virtues, and without private property they are impossible. Finally, we are told that if Plato's plans were good, someone would have thought of them sooner. I do not agree with Plato, but if anything could make me do so, it would be Aristotle's arguments against him." Actually, Russell agrees more with Plato than he lets on there. And it's interesting the way he uses different phrases. When we hear the word communism, something comes to our mind. And of course, Russell is a rough contemporary of ours. But we need to remember with regard to Russell that when he went to visit Lenin in the Great Soviet Experiment, he was a believer in the idea of communism and came away from the idea that it really could never work. It had turned into an almost religious doctrine that Russell decided he did not like. When he uses the word fellow traveler, that has a particular political meaning in Britain, so you might look that up. When he talks about things being held in common or things like private property, those have particular political charges. And of course, Russell himself was the third Earl Russell, grandson of a prime minister, one of the aristocrats in Britain. So it wasn't as if he was part of the underclass at all. He was one of the privileged sorts. So there's a lot of material in here. A lot of the way that he writes has a particular bent to it that I find fascinating and interesting to try to figure out. But he does write in a very engaging style. And in fact, this particular book, The History of Western Philosophy, is sort of what kept him paying his bills all the rest of his life. Once this was published, he was set for life. Other books that we use in the class include the Copleston book, and of course Copleston's book. This is volume 1. As you may know, Greece and Rome. He wrote 8 volumes of the history of Western philosophy, and Copleston is a very good person to be following in this regard. He's not quite as witty as is Russell. Russell didn't really make any apologies for putting a lot of his personality into things, and that's one of the reasons why some of you may be finding it more interesting to read, because there is a lot more personality there. Copleston is a very good reporter, whereas Russell is a very good writer. Some other books that you might be interested in, I've become enamored in the past year or two of something called the Oxford University Press's Very Short Introduction. They have a very short introduction on ancient philosophy by Julia Annis. They have one on pre-Socratic philosophy by Catherine Osborne, and they have one on Socrates by C.C.W. Taylor. These are all books that are about 120 pages long and not too long at that, so that you get a good encapsulation. They're not thorough and in-depth, but they're a good general overview for each of the things that they do. There are actually about 200 different short introductions to different people, places, and things. I've got almost all of the philosophy ones, and I'm hoping that someday I might be able to actually write one. There are a few philosophers they haven't sort of assigned yet, so I may be writing one on one of them. One of the things that I find interesting about these, and these can be had for about $10 each on Amazon.com, maybe even less if you get a used copy, and sometimes they have 3 for $4 deals, so you might get 4 of them for the price of 3. But they also have a touch of Russell, especially Catherine Osborne's here. She talks about Zeno's puzzles in the pre-Socratics. She talks about Heraclitus. She talks about Pythagoras. But then she has her chapter on the sophists called Spin Doctors of the 5th Century. So she sort of brings it up to date, and we can see different things that are going on. And in addition to talking about the ancient world, if you can see this picture here, she draws in current events. She draws in things that can relate to what's going on today. So I invite you to consider any of those sources as being fairly worthwhile, and I look forward, as I said, to reading more of what you have to say.